The Viking Age is often remembered for its longships cutting across stormy seas, for warriors charging into battle with axes flashing and shields raised, for raids that burned churches and terrified kings. But behind the legends of conquest and the tales of glory lies a much darker truth, a truth that most would rather not imagine. The Vikings were not only raiders and explorers, they were also enforcers of a brutal justice system, one where law and punishment were written not on parchment, but into flesh and bone. To understand the Norse world, we must step into that darkness, into the places where justice and cruelty became one, where executions were public lessons and torture was a weapon as sharp as any blade. If you're listening now, wherever you may be, I want you to pause for a moment. Think of your home, your town, your city. Now imagine living in a time with no police, no central prisons, no courts filled with judges. Imagine instead that law was enforced by your neighbors, your clan, and your chieftain. Imagine that punishment did not mean sitting behind bars, but often meant the end of your life, in front of everyone you knew. That was the world of the Vikings. It was not a world of soft justice, but of hard choices, where survival demanded obedience to custom, to honor, and to fear. The Vikings were not savages without rules. Far from it. They had assemblies called things, where free men gathered to settle disputes, trade, and make laws. But the enforcement of those laws was far more direct, far more personal, and often far more brutal than we might expect. For minor crimes like theft or insult, fines could be paid in silver or goods, and honor could sometimes be restored with compensation. Yet for greater crimes, betrayal, murder, oath-breaking, treason, there was no room for mercy. Justice in such cases was not quiet or hidden. It was carved into the body of the guilty for all to see. The most common form of execution was beheading. To us, it may seem swift, but for the Vikings it was also symbolic. A man might be taken before the community at the Thing, or on the orders of a chieftain. He would kneel or be forced to his knees, his hands bound, and an axe or sword would strike down. It was over in a single blow, but it was never just about killing one man. It was about showing others what breaking the law would cost. The crowd watched. The family of the wronged might watch. And in that moment, justice was performed not only in steel, but in memory. A beheading in the Viking Age was both a punishment and a performance. Yet not all executions were so swift. Many were hung from trees, left to sway in the wind, their lifeless bodies a warning to all who passed. Hanging carried its own weight of meaning in Norse culture. Odin himself, the chief of the gods, was said to have hung for 9 nights upon the world tree, pierced by a spear, to gain wisdom. To hang a man was to tie him, in a sense, to that divine story, but in the most twisted way. It marked him as judged, as punished, and his body remained as a silent teacher to anyone who dared defy the order of the community. For thieves, traitors, and those who betrayed trust, the hanging tree was the end. Another form of execution, especially for women accused of adultery or witchcraft, was drowning. The sagas tell us that women tied in sacks were sometimes cast into rivers or seas, their last breaths swallowed by the waters. Drowning stripped them of the chance to die like a warrior, stripped them of any chance to show courage with a final stand. It was a death of helplessness, chosen for those considered unworthy of facing a blade. In the cold waters of the north, drowning was both slow and certain, and its memory spread fear among all who heard of it. But executions were not only about enforcing law, they were about protecting the fragile fabric of Viking society. Life was hard. Land was scarce. Winters were long and merciless. If a man stole too much food, if a slave betrayed his master, if an enemy dared defy a chieftain, punishment had to be swift and brutal, because hesitation could mean disaster. Fear was a tool, as sharp as iron, and it kept communities from tearing. themselves apart. Slaves in particular lived under constant threat of punishment. A slave who tried to escape, who struck his master, or who failed in his duties could face whipping, branding, mutilation, or death. Slavery was an accepted part of Norse life, and while some slaves could be treated fairly, others were reminders that cruelty was always close at hand. A scar burned into the skin, a hand chopped away, or a neck placed beneath an axe. These were not just punishments for the guilty, but lessons for everyone else. Among enemies taken in battle, the fates could be darker still. Captives were sometimes ransomed, but others were tortured to make examples of them. To bind a man, to drag him through the mud, to cut him with blades or burn him with fire, these were acts meant to break not only the man, but the spirit of his comrades who heard of his fate. In an age where honor was everything, to be humiliated in death was worse than to be killed in fair combat. And then, of course, there is the most infamous of all Viking punishments, the blood eagle. The image is horrifying. A man stretched on the ground, his ribs split open, his lungs pulled out and spread like wings upon his back. Some sagas claim this was done to traitors or to enemies of great chiefs, an offering to Odin himself. But was it real? That is a question we will wrestle with later in this story. For now, understand this. Whether it was ever performed or not, the very tale of it was powerful enough to terrify generations. The blood eagle became a story of pure fear, whispered across firesides and written into sagas so that even kings shivered when the name was spoken. To live in the Viking Age was to live under the shadow of such punishments. To break the law was not just to risk death, but to risk death in a way that stripped you of dignity, that marked your name with shame forever. That is why executions were always public, always meant to be remembered, because memory was as strong a weapon as any axe. But the Vikings were not simply cruel for cruelty's sake. They were practical. In a world with no prisons, punishment had to be quick, final, and effective. If a man could not be trusted to live by the laws of the community, then he could not be allowed to live at all. Mercy was rare, because mercy could be weakness, and weakness could destroy a clan. And so, in every village, in every settlement, people lived with the knowledge that justice was close and cruel. They knew that an argument could end with exile, that a theft could end with a hanging, that a betrayal could end with an axe. They knew that the stories of torture, whether true or exaggerated, kept order just as much as the fear of hunger or cold. When we think of the Vikings as warriors, raiders, and kings, we must also remember them as judges and executioners, men who ruled not only by strength, but by the terror of what would happen to those who defied them. If beheadings, hangings, and drownings were the punishments that ended a life quickly, there were others in the Viking world that left a man alive but shattered, cast out to a fate sometimes even worse than death. For the Norse, punishment was not only about blood, it was about stripping a man of his place in the community, cutting him away from the roots of honor, family, and kinship that gave meaning to life. And in a society where survival depended on those bonds, exile could be the cruelest sentence of all. The Vikings called this punishment outlawry. To be declared an outlaw was to be declared dead in the eyes of your people. It did not always mean an executioner's axe. It meant that anyone could kill you without penalty, that no one was bound to protect you, and that every shelter and every fire was closed to you. There were two levels of this fate: lesser outlawry, which lasted for 3 years, and greater outlawry, which lasted forever. In either case, the punishment tore a man from the very fabric of society, and in an age where men survived by the strength of their kin, it was almost impossible to endure. Imagine it. Standing at the assembly, the thing where your neighbors gathered to watch. A dispute had been judged, the verdict given, and the law speaker pronounced your fate. You were no longer part of them. Your rights were gone. your voice silenced, your name stained. You might still breathe, but your life as you knew it was over. From that moment you carried nothing but shame and hunger. Exile meant wandering through the forests and mountains, sleeping in caves, stealing food when you could, or begging from strangers who risked their own honor to help you. If you were caught within the boundaries of your old home, anyone could strike you down, even the weakest boy or the oldest man. Some outlaws tried to survive by raiding, by forming bands of other broken men who lived like wolves, but most were hunted, starved, or killed before their sentence ended. For many, outlawry was not just punishment, but a slow, cruel execution stretched over months or years. This system was harsh, but it served a purpose. Outlawry made punishment visible without bloodshed. It reminded every man and woman that belonging to a community was a privilege, not a right, and that dishonor could strip it away as quickly as a sword could take a head. It also created stories. Outlaws became figures of fear and warning, their names carried in whispers across villages. To children, they were monsters hiding in the woods. To men, they were reminders of the price of breaking trust. Yet the Vikings knew other punishments too. Punishments that did not always kill but scarred the body or the soul. One of the most dreaded was mutilation. A thief might lose a hand. A liar might lose a tongue. A man who spread dishonor might have his nose cut away. These punishments left marks that could never be hidden, brands of shame that every face in the market, every neighbor in the longhouse would recognize at once. To walk with such wounds was to carry your crime with you forever, an endless reminder that you had failed the laws of your people. Slaves endured the worst of this cruelty. They could be whipped until flesh tore, burned with irons, or branded like cattle. Some were made to wear iron collars engraved with words that marked them as runaways, so that anyone could know their shame. For the freeborn, such punishments were rare, for the stain of dishonor was often worse than death itself. But for slaves, mutilation and torture were tools of control, weapons that masters used to keep fear alive in their households. Public humiliation was another form of punishment. A woman accused of sexual dishonor might have her hair cut short, stripping away the symbol of her status and beauty. A man who failed in courage or insulted another might be forced to endure shameful rituals, mocked by his community, forced to stand before the assembly as others laughed at his disgrace. In Norse culture, where reputation and honor were more valuable than gold, such humiliation could be a punishment that wounded deeper than the axe. And then there were punishments meant not just to kill, not just to shame, but to terrify. The Vikings understood the power of fear, and they used it as carefully as they used steel. Captured enemies might be tied to posts, beaten with rods, or slowly burned. Their cries filled the air, not because the Vikings enjoyed the sound, but because those cries carried across villages, across valleys, warning all who heard them of the fate that awaited traitors and foes. We know from the sagas that some punishments blurred the line between law and vengeance. A man might kill another in battle, and that was fair. But if he killed without cause or betrayed hospitality, then the family of the slain might demand blood payment. Sometimes silver could pay that debt, but sometimes only death would satisfy it. The thing might confirm it, or the families might arrange it themselves, but in the end, punishment was as much about restoring balance as it was about cruelty. To break the law was to upset the balance of honor, and the punishment was the weight that brought it back. Among the worst of all fates was to be denied a proper burial. In Norse belief, to die without honor was to risk being shut out from Valhalla, or even from hell. To have your body left unburied, to rot in the open, or to be cast into a bog was to be condemned in both this life and the next. Sometimes the executed were left exposed, their bones gnawed by wolves and crows, so that no one would mistake them for the honored dead. Such a punishment carried a spiritual weight heavier than any chain, for it was not just your life that ended, but your afterlife as well. The sagas tell us that people feared this above all. Men who faced the axe sometimes begged to be buried with their weapons. Women facing drowning prayed that their families would at least speak their names at the next feast. In Norse culture, memory was everything, and punishment that erased your name was the worst kind of death. So when we look at these punishments, exile, mutilation, humiliation, torture, dishonor, we see more than cruelty. We see a society that used fear as law, shame as judgment, and pain as a language everyone could understand. These punishments were not random acts of violence, but deliberate tools, chosen to keep order in a world where order was fragile and survival hung by a thread. Yet even in this dark landscape, there were moments of choice. A chieftain could choose mercy if it served his power. A family could accept silver instead of blood. A slave might earn freedom and escape the lash. The Vikings were not machines of cruelty. They were humans navigating a hard world with hard answers. But the shadow of those punishments never left them, and the stories of them never left their descendants. This is why, when we think of Viking justice, we must imagine not only the clash of swords, but the silence of exile, the shame of mutilation, the fear of dishonor, and the terror of dying without a name. Each of these punishments shaped the Viking world as much as any raid or battle, and yet the darkest part of the story still lies ahead. For beyond exile, beyond mutilation, beyond the lash and the rope, there were punishments so cruel, so monstrous, that they became legends of horror whispered through the centuries. The sagas speak of them, the poets recorded them, and historians still argue whether they were real or myth. These are the punishments that go beyond justice and step into the realm of terror itself. And at the center of those stories waits the blood eagle. The shadow of outlawry, mutilation, and dishonor had already marked the Viking world as a place where punishment cut deeply into both flesh and spirit. Yet when we move deeper into the sagas, into the whispers of the poets, and the tales retold, across generations we arrive at a place where justice and cruelty seem to dissolve into something even darker. This is the realm of punishment so terrifying that they were remembered not just as history, but as legend. At the heart of that realm stands the punishment known as the blood eagle. The blood eagle is perhaps the most famous and most feared execution associated with the Vikings. It appears in a handful of sagas and skaldic poems, always tied to vengeance, betrayal, or a need to make a statement so powerful that no enemy would ever forget it. The act was not simple killing. It was a ritual, a spectacle meant to horrify both victim and witness. In the accounts that survive, the victim was laid face down or bound upright, and his back was cut open along the spine. Ribs were severed from the backbone and pulled outward, spreading like the wings of a bird. The lungs were then pulled through the opening so that they hung outside the body, fluttering in the cold air like bloody feathers. Whether or not the blood eagle was truly performed has been debated for centuries. Some historians argue that it was nothing more than a literary invention, a poetic metaphor misunderstood by later readers. Others believe that it was a real punishment, carried out in rare moments of ritual vengeance, perhaps exaggerated by the poets but rooted in fact. The truth may lie somewhere in between, but what matters is not only whether it was real, but why it was remembered. The blood eagle was more than execution. It was a symbol of terror, a punishment that reached into the imagination and carved itself into memory. One of the most cited examples comes from the story of King Ella of Northumbria, the ruler said to have killed the legendary Viking Ragnar Lothbrok. In retaliation, Ragnar's sons invaded England, defeated Ella in battle, and performed the blood eagle upon him. In some versions, the act is described in detail. Ella's ribs torn open, his lungs spread like wings. His life ended not in the quiet of beheading, or the swiftness of a blade, but in a ritual that turned his body into a warning. Whether it happened exactly as described is uncertain, but in Viking imagination, the blood eagle became the ultimate punishment for betrayal and dishonor. The cruelty of this execution is hard for us to even imagine. To cut through ribs with an axe or knife, to pull open lungs while a man still breathed, it is almost beyond human endurance. And perhaps that is the point. If the blood eagle was ever performed, it was not meant to be a common punishment. It was meant to terrify, to create a spectacle so haunting that stories of it would echo for generations. Even if the victim died quickly from shock or blood loss, the image remained. A man's body turned into the wings of a bird, his death a performance of pain. But the blood eagle, famous as it is, was not the only way that the Vikings used cruelty to control or to conquer. On the battlefield and in the aftermath of raids, torture and execution were often tools of war. Captured enemies might be bound, beaten, or burned. Some were tied to posts and used for target practice, their bodies pierced with arrows for sport. Others were dragged behind ships or horses, their flesh torn by wood and stone until life left them. These acts were not always codified by law. They were acts of vengeance, of rage, or of demonstration. In the brutal logic of the Viking world, they served as messages. Resist us, and this will be your fate. We hear too of burning alive, a punishment particularly associated with vengeance killings. Houses might be set aflame with enemies locked inside, turning the very shelter of the home into a fiery tomb. In some sagas, warriors describe such acts not with shame, but with pride, boasting of the screams of those trapped within. Fire, the great gift of survival, became in these moments a weapon of terror. There are also accounts of men being stoned to death by their communities, a punishment that turned every hand against the condemned. Stones were plentiful in Scandinavia, and their use in execution symbolized the collective weight of judgment. It was not the swing of a single axe, but the many blows of the crowd, each stone a reminder that society itself had cast you out. Among slaves and captives, cruelty often served as a lesson. A runaway might be chained to a rock by the sea, left to drown as the tide rose. A thief might be flogged until his skin peeled. A prisoner of war might be forced to endure days of torment, slowly deprived of food and water, until death came not as violence but as exhaustion. These punishments were not merely about the individual victim. They were about creating fear in every witness, making sure that no one forgot the power of the master, the chieftain, or the victorious warband. Yet even within this cruelty, there is a strange logic. In a world without prisons, where jails were rare or non-existent, punishment had to be swift, visible, and final. There was no cell to lock a man in for 10 years. There was the axe, the rope, the fire, or the exile. And when the punishment needed to go beyond death, when it needed to reach into the imagination of friend and foe alike, it became ritual, became spectacle, became the blood eagle. The sagas do not always agree on how often such tortures occurred. Some suggest they were rare, used only in extreme cases. Others describe them as if they were part of a grim tradition. What is clear is that the Vikings, like many ancient peoples, understood that fear was as powerful as steel. A man who heard the story of the blood eagle might surrender before the blade touched him, might pay tribute, rather than risk the fate of Ella. In this way, cruelty became a weapon of conquest, a form of warfare that struck not just the body, but the mind. Consider, too, the role of ritual. For the Norse, life and death were filled with ceremony, with songs, with symbols. Sacrifices were made to the gods, offerings placed in rivers and bogs, feasts held for the dead. It is possible that punishments like the blood eagle carried this same ritual weight, transforming an act of vengeance into something that honored Odin, or that sent a message to the ancestors. In this sense, torture and execution were not only about pain, they were about meaning. Whether or not the blood eagle was real, the fact that it was remembered tells us what mattered to the Vikings. They feared dishonor, they feared exile, they feared the loss of their name. But they also feared the spectacle of pain, the possibility that death itself could become humiliation, that the body could be turned into a story of defeat. The blood eagle captured all of that in one image. A man's chest split open, his lungs spread wide, his death turned into a canvas of terror. And so the Vikings, whether they performed it once, 100 times, or never at all, carried the blood eagle in their culture like a shadow. It became part of the way outsiders saw them, part of the reason their enemies trembled when dragon-headed ships appeared on the horizon. For what enemy could fight without fear if he believed that defeat might end not only in death but in a fate worse than death, a fate carved into his very body? The darkness of Viking punishment does not end here. There are still stories to tell, of sacrifices to the gods, of executions carried out at holy sites, of captives offered up in rituals that blurred the line between law, religion, and cruelty. In these acts, we see the Vikings not just as warriors, but as people who believed that pain and blood could serve higher powers, that execution could be more than justice, it could be an offering. And it is to those rituals, those sacrifices, those sacred killings that we now turn. For if the blood eagle was the most infamous punishment, the sacrifices of men and women to Odin, to Thor, and to the other gods were acts that reveal the deepest connection between Viking cruelty and Viking faith. The blood eagle may be the most famous act of Viking cruelty, remembered in sagas and whispered in fear, but it was not the only place where death and ritual intertwined. To understand the full weight of Viking punishment, we must step into a world where execution was not only about law or vengeance, but about faith itself. The Norse lived in a cosmos where gods demanded sacrifice, where blood was an offering as much as it was a sentence, and where the line between justice and ritual killing could vanish in the smoke of the hearth or the fire of a sacred pyre. Among the most striking accounts of Viking ritual executions are those tied to the worship of Odin, the All-Father. Odin was not a gentle god. He was the god of war, wisdom, and death, a wanderer who sought knowledge through sacrifice and who demanded offerings of blood. The sagas and the writings of foreign observers suggest that human lives were sometimes offered to him, especially in times of great need. Before battle, after famine, or in the face of disaster. These sacrifices could be prisoners of war, slaves, or sometimes even chosen volunteers seeking honor in death. The method of sacrifice varied, but one of the most haunting was hanging. Odin himself had hanged for 9 nights on the great tree, Yggdrasil to gain wisdom, pierced by his own spear, and so his followers mirrored that fate in their offerings. Victims were strung from trees or gallows, their bodies left to swing in the wind as a gift to the god. The symbolism was powerful. The hanged man became like Odin, bound to the world tree, his life flowing away as an offering that joined the divine. But hanging was not the only ritual execution. In some cases, victims were stabbed with spears, mimicking Odin's own wounding. Archaeological evidence from bog sites suggests that some bodies were drowned as part of ritual sacrifice, bound and cast into the water, their souls sent into the depths where spirits and gods might receive them. Fire, too, played its role, with captives burned alive or their bodies consumed on pyres that turned their deaths into pillars of smoke rising to the heavens. We know from accounts like those of the Arab traveller Ibn Fadlan, who witnessed the funeral of a Viking chieftain along the Volga, that death in Norse culture could be surrounded with ritual violence. In his description, a slave girl volunteered, or was compelled, to join her master in death. She was led into a tent, given intoxicating drinks, and then killed by a group of women, her body laid beside her masters in the ship before it was burned. To the Norse, this was not murder. It was an offering, a way to ensure that the dead would not walk alone in the afterlife. To us, it is a stark reminder that cruelty was woven into the fabric of faith. The connection between torture and religion becomes even clearer when we look at the great festivals described in medieval texts. At Uppsala in Sweden, the chronicler Adam of Bremen claimed that every 9 years great sacrifices were held, involving animals of every kind, and men. Victims were hung in the sacred grove, their blood staining the ground, their bodies swinging from branches like grim decorations. Whether this account was exaggerated or not, it reflects a truth. For the Vikings, execution could serve not only as punishment, but as communication with the divine. This is where Viking cruelty becomes difficult for us to fully grasp. For the Norse, these acts were not necessarily sadism. They were part of a worldview in which blood was power, death was a gift, and pain could open the path between worlds. To kill a man as an offering to Odin was not only to end his life, but to honor a god, to strengthen a community, to tip the balance of fate in your favor. What we see as torture, they might have seen as duty, yet that does not soften the brutality. Imagine standing in a sacred grove, the smell of pine heavy in the air, the ground slick with blood. Men, women, and animals hanged from branches, the silence broken only by the creak of rope and the murmur of prayers. Children watching, learning that this was the price of survival, the rhythm of faith. Such scenes linger in the imagination, not only as history, but as nightmare. The sagas also tell of sacrifices carried out in times of desperation. If crops failed, if storms wrecked ships, if enemies pressed too close, then offerings were made. Sometimes these offerings were livestock, but sometimes it was men. A captured enemy might be chosen, his death both vengeance and prayer. A slave girl might be offered, her blood staining the earth in hopes that the gods would be appeased. In these moments, execution became more than cruelty. It became a bargaining chip with the divine. This merging of punishment, vengeance, and sacrifice meant that for the Vikings, death was never simple. To kill a man was to shape his fate, his memory, and his place in both this world and the next. To execute him as punishment was to strip him of honor. To sacrifice him to the gods was to give his death a cosmic weight, and to torture him, to stretch out his suffering, was to create a story that would echo long after his body had rotted away. Consider how fear must have spread when stories of these rituals reached foreign ears. Monks in distant cloisters, merchants along the rivers, peasants in villages across Europe, they heard tales of men carved open, of victims hanged to Odin, of captives burned alive in ships. Whether all of it was true or not, did not matter. The image of the Viking as both warrior and butcher, both raider and priest of blood, took hold. Fear grew not only from the sword, but from the imagination, and in this way, cruelty became a weapon more powerful than steel. But within the Viking world itself, there was always tension. Not every man embraced these rituals. Not every community agreed. Some sagas hint at disputes, at men who questioned the need for human sacrifice, who sought to replace blood with silver or offerings of goods. As Christianity began to spread, these tensions grew stronger. For the new faith condemned such practices, calling them heathen and wicked. Yet for centuries, the old ways endured, and execution by rope, by spear, by flame continued to serve both law and religion. We must also remember that these acts were not unique to the Norse. Across the ancient world, cultures practiced ritual, sacrifice, from the Celts of Gaul to the priests of Mesoamerica. What makes the Viking practices stand out is the way they combined them with their system of honor and justice. A man might die by axe for breaking the law, but he might also die by rope as an offering to Odin. A captive might be burned not just as punishment, but as prayer. Death became a language with many dialects, each carrying a different meaning, each reminding the community of their place between gods and men. And so, when we look back on Viking torture and execution, we must see more than cruelty. We must see a culture in which pain and blood were woven into survival, into faith, into identity. The sagas may exaggerate, the poets may embellish, but the core truth remains. For the Vikings, execution was not only a way to punish the guilty, but a way to shape the fate of the living and the dead alike. Yet, as the centuries passed and the Norse came into greater contact with Christian Europe, their punishments and rituals began to be judged not as law or faith, but as savagery. Missionaries condemned them, chroniclers recorded them in horror, and even some Norse began to question them. The clash between these two worlds, the pagan and the Christian, would ultimately reshape Viking justice itself. But before we reach that transformation, there is still one last shadow to explore. For the legacy of Viking cruelty did not end with their rituals. It lived on in the stories told about them, in the chronicles written by their enemies, in the fear that lingered long after their ships had sailed. And it is in that legacy, in the way the world remembered them, that we find the true power of their torture and execution methods. As the long centuries of Viking raiding and conquest gave way to the slow embrace of Christianity, the old punishments and rituals of death began to fade. Yet the memory of them, the fear they inspired, and the legends they birthed did not disappear. If anything, they grew stronger, woven into the stories of monks, chroniclers, and poets who would forever paint the Norse as both warriors and executioners, as men who wielded not only the sword, but also terror itself. When a monk in Ireland or England wrote of the Vikings, he was not simply describing an enemy who plundered churches or burned villages. He was capturing the horror of men who, in rumor and in truth, practiced blood-soaked rituals, carved open their captives, and hanged men as gifts to cruel gods. Whether these monks had seen such acts, or merely repeated tales passed down by trembling survivors, the image was powerful. For the Christian world, the Vikings became not only pagans but demons, their executions proof of their godlessness. The irony, of course, is that the Norse themselves saw it differently. To them, execution was justice, sacrifice was duty, and cruelty was sometimes necessity. A man who betrayed his kin deserved death. A captive enemy could be offered to Odin as a way of gaining favor. A thief might be hanged not only to punish him, but to warn others that honor was more important than life. This clash of perspectives, the Norse seeing themselves as men of law and faith, while others saw them as savages, created the lasting tension that still colors their legacy today. We must remember, too, that execution was not always an act of cruelty. In many cases, it was simply the harsh necessity of survival. In a world without prisons, where a man could not be locked away for years, justice had to be swift and final. Theft, treachery, murder, these could not be tolerated in small communities, where every life mattered. To kill the guilty was to protect the innocent, to preserve the fragile balance of society. In that sense, Viking executions were no more cruel than those of other medieval cultures. But it was the ritualistic and symbolic acts, the blood eagle, the hangings in sacred groves, the burning of captives, that gave their punishments an edge that cut deep into memory. By the time Christianity spread across Scandinavia, in the 10th and 11th centuries, these practices began to be condemned. Missionaries spoke against human sacrifice, outlawry, and ritual killing, calling them sins. Kings who converted to the new faith often outlawed the old punishments, replacing them with Christian forms of justice, fines, imprisonment, penance. Yet even as the laws changed, the stories of the old ways persisted. The sagas, written down in Iceland centuries later, preserved the memory of torture and execution, sometimes with pride, sometimes with horror, but always with vivid detail. The blood eagle itself, whether real or symbolic, became one of the most enduring images of Viking cruelty. Later writers debated whether it had ever been performed at all, or whether it was a poetic metaphor for defeat. But in the minds of many, it was real enough. It became a symbol of Viking ferocity, an act so shocking that it needed no proof, only the power of belief. And belief, in the end, is what gave Viking cruelty its greatest legacy. For whether every tale was true or not, people believed them. Enemies feared them. And fear was often more effective than the sharpest axe. A raid did not need to kill thousands to succeed. It only needed to terrify enough survivors that the name of the Northmen spread like fire through the land. In this way, the reputation of Viking torture became a weapon in itself, carried not in ships or steel, but in story and song. The sagas themselves reveal how execution shaped not only fear, but also honor. To die bravely under torture was a way of proving strength. A man who faced the blood eagle without a scream was remembered as a hero, his endurance a mark of true Viking spirit. In this, cruelty became a stage upon which both vengeance and honor were displayed. The executioner proved his power, the victim proved his courage, and the community watching learned the lessons of both. As centuries passed, these stories traveled far beyond the fjords and longhouses of Scandinavia. They entered European chronicles, where they were retold as warnings against heathen savagery. They entered legend, where they grew darker with every retelling. And in time, they entered modern imagination, where the Vikings became not only explorers and traders, but also executioners, their cruelty exaggerated until it became myth. Yet to reduce them to mere butchers would be to miss the complexity of their world. The Vikings were not mindless killers. They were farmers, traders, poets, lawgivers, and sailors who created some of the most intricate legal systems of their time. Their executions, as brutal as they seem, were part of a culture that valued law and honor deeply. To kill a man outside of law was murder. To kill him within it was justice. To sacrifice a man outside of ritual was cruelty. To sacrifice him to Odin was faith. In the end, the story of Viking torture and execution methods is not only about cruelty, but about the way humans use death to shape meaning. The Norse turned punishment into spectacle, sacrifice into prayer, pain into memory. Their enemies turned those acts into symbols of savagery, warnings written in ink and blood. And we, centuries later, look back on them with fascination and horror. Drawn to the edge where history meets myth, where justice meets cruelty, and where men once lived and died by rules that now seem both alien and familiar. For when we strip away the centuries of fear and legend, what remains is a simple truth. The Vikings, like all people, used the tools they had to survive, to control, to inspire, and to terrify. And in their world, those tools were not only swords and ships, but also fire, rope, axe, and ritual. Their cruelty has echoed through the ages, not because it was unique, but because it was remembered, recorded, and retold until it became part of the very identity of the Northmen. So when we speak today of the blood eagle, of hangings in sacred groves, of captives burned alive or drowned as offerings, we are not only speaking of acts of violence. We are speaking of the power of story, of the way execution can outlive the executed, of how terror can become tradition and tradition can become legend. The Vikings may have passed into history 1,000 years ago, but the shadow of their punishments still stretches across our imagination. And perhaps that is their greatest victory, not the raids they won, not the kingdoms they carved, but the fear and fascination they left behind. A fear so deep that it still chills us when we whisper their tales. a fascination so strong that we still seek to understand it, to peel back the layers of myth and glimpse the raw truth beneath. The Vikings are gone, but the stories of their torture and executions remain, haunting us like echoes in a longhouse, at night, reminding us of a world where death was not only an ending, but a weapon, a ritual and a story written in blood.